Okay, so taking a look at our data is just a little bit more and figuring out kind of this idea of you can cast data to be a certain data type, and also just to identify the data type if you're not sure. So say you've written some code, you're not sure is the computer reading this as a string or an integer or a float or a list or whatever. So here I've got a V to Z here, and I've set up myself with a couple of different ones. And I'll be honest with you, I'm too lazy now to actually try identify them from sight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a short little bit of code. There's a built-in function into Python called type, which is basically it's a function which tells you the type of data it is. So here I'm just going to print what the type of data V, W, X, Y, Z is. So if we run our code, it tells me that the first one, V, is a float, which it certainly is. Tells me the next one's a list. Yep. This is a Boolean, bool. Then this is an integer, which is just a number, positive, negative. And then finally that this one is a string, and because it has the quotation marks. So that's a nice quick way if you've got your code and you're not really sure what the data is or how it's reading it, you can actually just put it in and test it yourself to print out the type that you have. So then we'll have a look at if you want to specifically cast something to be a certain data type. So here, I've got A, B, and C. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just say A is the string 5, B is the float 5, and C is the integer 5. So in each of these cases, when I print it, kind of just looks like 5, 5, and 5. Here, the float has clearly made it a decimal place to signify a float. This is the number 5, whereas the first one here is actually the symbol 5. So this is going to be important when you start adding in user inputs to things. So I'll just cover this up and I'll do an example, best way to kind of see this. So if I've made some code here. The test, I've made a variable called test, and I'm going to say input, please input a number. And I'm going to print the number you inputted was whatever you inputted in test. So let's run this. So please input a number. I'm going to say the number 4, and I press enter. The number you inputted was 4. Great. Now, that means this is a string because it's a bunch of text, okay? And that means it thinks of this as a string. So what I might say is actually no, I really only want them to input an integer. So what I should do is I should say test is input an integer input. Please input a number. So now, please input a number 4. And I get an error, and it's basically saying you can only you've got a string and you've got an integer, and they're not going to work together. So what you could do, okay, and this will kind of come in relevant when you start getting user inputs. Sometimes they'll be inputting as a string, sometimes as an integer or a float, and it's going to screw up your code halfway down. So what you can do is you can just declare that this test thing that you've just found here, you can say, well, look, I always want you to take that as a string. So turn whatever test is into a string. So if I say 67, it'll turn 67 into the string 6 and 7. Now, if you try to do maths with that in there, it because it's a string, your mathematical operators won't work and you need to be careful with it. But it's just something to be aware when you're handling data to always kind of be thinking, is this a string? Is it a float? Is it an integer? And how you can adjust your code to where you need to by just putting string in front. I could turn this into float. Now it won't work when I run this because it's going to tell me I can't mix a float and whatever. Yeah, a float and a string. But you can turn your test here, your variable, into whatever you want. And that's kind of just a little overview of how to do casting. So to specify the data type you want and how to identify the data type, and then to be aware of it when you're creating variables. What type of variable are you creating? Best of luck.